Okay, everyone. Welcome to NewTrition. Thank you for all showing up. This event was, this is the first one we're having, and it was an idea that Kenny and I had because we were thinking about the reason why we came to study nutrition as master's students or as PhD students, as professors, as staff. Like, why are you interested or drawn to this topic? And we noticed that at least some of the things that we were most excited about we weren't getting in all of our daily classes. So we thought about a way that we could all come together, share topics and ideas that we're excited about, and kind of do it in a much less formal format where people can talk about whatever they think is exciting and up and coming in nutrition. So the format we'll be doing today will be sort of like 5 to 10 minute talks, each of which will be followed by a really short Q&A session to talk about some questions that were on your mind during the person's talk. And then after the whole 4 talks are done, then we'll go into the cafe and have a more sort of productive discussion where we can all share ideas and that kind of thing. Before we start, I just want to thank Sean for giving us his time and giving a talk today, and also Amali for not only talking, but also being huge in helping us organize the logistics and publicize it to make sure that all you guys would come and everything. So thank you both very much for helping us out. And without further ado, Kenny's going to come up and start us off.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. And I want to talk to you guys today about my superpower. Now, I don't know if I've talked to anyone about this, but when Superman looks at a brick wall, he sees this. And that's because he can use his X-ray vision to see what's behind it. Now, when I look at this cup of coffee, I see this. It's pretty cool, right? All right, so maybe Superman might have a little bit cooler power than mine, but I want to try to convince you that my power is pretty cool too. So this already looks like this big jumble of letters and lines right here, and this is only maybe 8 or so compounds. But in coffee, we've already identified over 1,000 compounds, and we've identified almost 70,000 compounds in the foods that you and I eat on a daily basis. And so this presents a pretty cool opportunity, but it also presents a problem because this diversity of compounds means that there's no way we can actually gain information about them in any systematic way in the lab because the space is just too big. So ideally, we'd have some way of gaining information about the compounds that doesn't require us to use laboratory methods. And that's where this technique comes in that I've been working on. This is not my technique, but I've been using it in the lab for the last year or so in the HNRCA. And that's called QSAR, or Quantitative Structure Activity Relationship. And this sounds complicated, but really just means that we can use the structure of chemicals to predict how they'll act in the body. And so to give you an example of this, here are 2 molecules that are both known to target the dopamine receptor in the body. And they're fairly different molecules, but you'll notice these areas that are highlighted in green. And they're highlighted that way because it is those areas of the molecules that sort of imbue this bioactivity and those areas that are responsible for sort of docking to this receptor and constituting the activity. So this is all well and good for dopamine receptors and for these molecules where we already know what activates the dopamine receptor. But what about for this set of food compounds for which we have a bunch of structures and basically little else? We'd ideally like to have some other set of compounds that are already quite well characterized and that we know their target information in the body that we can then compare to these food compounds. And it turns out that we actually have that in the set of pharmaceutical drugs. And this is really useful to us because drugs are very well characterized because of the process that they have to go through in order to be approved for commercial use. So you can imagine that if we can combine this drug information with this QSAR method we could have a pretty neat workflow for finding information about food compounds. And so that's basically what we've done. We can essentially start with a set of genes related to some outcome of interest. And in our work, that's been related to the outcome of serum triglycerides, which is a measure of heart disease risk that is we generally want to keep low. And so we take that set of genes and we can generate from some sort of database a set of drugs that are known to target those proteins coded for by those genes in the body. And finally, we can move from these drugs using this QSAR method to generate a set of food compounds. And the big idea is that then we can take these food compounds and hypothesize that they might not only have activity against those genes, but potentially have triglyceride-lowering effects in the body. And so I was kind of nervous at this point in the experiment because I was fairly certain that we'd be able to take a set of genes, find a set of drugs from that, and eventually find a set of food compounds. But it wasn't at all clear that we could then show that those food compounds would actually lower triglycerides in vivo. But we actually were able to show that. So here's one case study, and the drug is celestrol, and it's known to target the gene TNF, which was one of the genes in our gene set. And here surrounding it are these 4 chemicals. They're all food compounds that we found to be similar. And we actually were able to find that 2 of these, azuki sapogenol and glyceritic acid, have actually been shown to lower triglycerides when they're dosed in animal models. And this is really exciting, not only because it validates our model and this method for finding information about food compounds, but also because then we can maybe take some of these other compounds that are also similar to celestrol and hypothesize that those might be active in lowering triglycerides as well. And that's a pretty cool result. So you might have noticed something missing from this workflow, and it's something that sort of is a logical next step after food compounds. And it's sort of the reason we're all here at nutrition school. And so, of course, that is kombucha. Or I guess we can expand it to foods as a whole. And so we wanted to figure out a way to go about finding information about how to prescribe is a term used loosely, but how to figure out a diet that might be helpful in lowering triglycerides based on this food compound information that we have. And so one idea we had was to look at food subgroups. Because, for example, we all know that fruits and vegetables are healthy, and if you ate a lot of fruits and vegetables, you'd probably end up with lower triglyceride levels. But we already tell people to increase their fruit and vegetable intake, and it doesn't really work. So what if instead you were able to, say, recommend that someone eat citrus fruits over berries? Now that might be a more practical, applicable recommendation that someone could actually make, changing a fruit for a fruit instead of a grain for a fruit or something like that. And this coincided well with the fact that I've been begging my advisor, Larry, to make a network diagram for a long time because I think they're awesome and they look really neat. And so here's the result of what we ended up making, and he finally let me make one to demonstrate our results here. And here you can see the nodes on the outside are these circles that correspond to food subgroups. And they're colored by their overall food group, something like fruits, vegetables, teas. And their size is based on the number of our compound set that are found in that subgroup, where these compounds we suspect might have an impact on triglyceride levels. And this is pretty cool because it allows us to make sort of preliminary conclusions from it. So we could maybe say that teas over here on the left, which are things like black tea or green tea, might be more effective than herbal teas up on the right at specifically lowering triglyceride levels. Or we could maybe look at citrus up there on the left and say maybe citrus is slightly more effective than tropical fruits at lowering triglycerides. And this is a pretty interesting result if we can make the method quite robust. And so potentially the most exciting thing about this workflow is the fact that we can start with pretty much any gene we want, or any gene set we want, and target basically any outcome. So one of those could simply be, let's take out triglyceride and let's instead look at a gene set related to fasting glucose or related to LDL cholesterol. But what might be even more sort of nifty would be if we could take, let's say, a gene set related to lifespan. Genes that maybe are found in a genome-wide association study as they're associated with longer life or less chronic disease. And if we could find a set of food compounds and therefore a set of foods that target those genes, then maybe we could actually construct a diet that would be helpful in extending longevity. Or what about sleep? So maybe we could look at a set of genes that are affected by sleep, and then we can get, again, a set of compounds and therefore a diet that might be helpful in instances of jet lag or of shift work. And we could actually eat a diet full of compounds that affect the body in a way similar to the way sleep does. And that would be pretty exciting. So we tend to have sort of this idea, now that we're in nutrition school, of us versus the pharmaceutical industry. We're espousing this natural, preventative way of life, and then the pharmaceutical companies just want to push a pill on us to solve our ills. But I would argue that if we can instead take some information from the pharmaceutical industry, then we can use that to inform the way we eat, and in that way, hopefully get the best of both worlds. Thank you. So yeah, I guess you can do questions now. We'll probably do maybe 3 or 4 questions after each talk, and then we can have a greater discussion later on. Yeah, Shish.
So, when you say structurally similar compounds to the ones that are found in drugs, how certain can you be the compounds function in the same way? I'm asking this because I recall there is cis fat and there's trans fat, right? So it's just a difference of where the bond is located. So how can you distinguish whether how do you determine if the compounds are structurally similar or not?
So the way you go about that is you're essentially, when you're determining what food compounds will act theoretically in a similar way to the drugs, you can actually train a model not only in the sense that, these compounds are relatively similar, but you can actually train a model to recognize the specific components of a drug that are giving it that activity. So as you saw, if you remember with the green shading on those 2 chemicals, the chemicals might have had cis-trans somewhere else, but the point is that there was one area in which they were similar. And so this model that you'd create, and of course there's a bunch of types of models that you could create, but in theory, your model would try to at least discriminate between the parts of the chemical that are relevant, and if there's a really important part and there is a cis-trans isomerization, then it would not predict that it would be an activator in that way. Yeah, Kayla.
First of all, cool presentation, and I really like the idea. But also, what about the fact that most pharmaceutical drugs are generally derived from plants found, in chemicals found naturally in nature? What about just one fact and
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's absolutely true that many pharmaceuticals, and I think it used to be something like 80%, and nowadays it's 50 or so, compounds that are used as drugs came from natural sources. So the idea is not necessarily that these have to be separate entities, but rather that we're simply looking for a set of compounds, and as large as it is, the larger the better, we simply want to use these compounds to inform our knowledge about the food compounds that we don't understand well. And the other aspect to it is we're not only trying to look for one compound that's found in food that could activate PPAR gamma, that gene, or something like that, but we're actually trying to sort of design this whole diet and a set of food compounds. And in that way, it might not necessarily be useful just to say, we found one natural compound that acts on a gene. Yeah, so this was definitely preliminary results, and what we're working on now is potentially constructing a better model, as sort of like Ashish was bringing up. If we want a better model to be more sure that our predictions are robust before we kind of go and try to do serious work into developing recommendations based on it. But that would certainly be something in the future to do. Yeah, Julia?
This is really interesting. My only concern in this is that I feel like this kind of has like really similar aspects to the ideas of like superfoods and like supplements and how they just will solve all your problems. And I'm curious what you would do to kind of mitigate that and prevent that from going down that route with this kind of topic.
So I almost think of it as the antithesis of that in a way, because the whole idea is that we're not trying to say you should eat goji berries. You know, okay, goji berries are the solution to this, or kombucha, as we already know that's the solution. But we're not trying to necessarily say that. We're trying to say, well, if you generally move your diet towards citrus fruits and you generally move it towards this kind of dairy product versus that, or something like that, because we're working with a set of compounds and not a specific compound, it allows us to think in terms of sort of patterns rather than individual foods. So in that way, that's kind of why I think it's almost in the other direction from the superfood concept, if that makes sense. Yeah. Dana? Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but you're talking about starting at an individual, like personalized kind of genetic level. Let's look at this person's genes. But you're talking about population level recommendations, or maybe could you just clarify to what extent individual level is involved or population level is involved? How can you go in between those two levels?
Yeah, so when I've been in this talk so far, when I've mentioned genes, when I refer to a gene, and I should have clarified this earlier, but when I refer to a gene, I simply mean the protein coded for by that gene. So if something acts on a gene, it's acting on the protein coded for by that gene. But you absolutely, so these recommendations that I've been talking about would simply apply overall to anyone in theory. And then there's another component you could bring in here, which is that you could look at whether individuals have, let's say, a polymorphism in one of the given genes in our list that we find food compounds from, and we could say, oh, well, they have a problem or a different allele there, so we want to maybe, I don't know, recommend more food compounds that target it or less food compounds that target it, I don't know, something like that. Yeah, so all right, so let's get moving on, and I'd like to introduce Molly Nelson, who's going to give us some administrative perspective.
Figure this one out. Here we go. All right. Hello, everyone. I see a few sort of new faces here. So for those of you who don't know me or sort of what I do here at the school, I'm Molly. I am the administrative coordinator for the Office of Student Affairs, which is a bit of a mouthful. And my primary role here is general support for the Office of Student Affairs. I am in room 129, which is just around the corner in what I lovingly refer to as my office fishbowl. I'm sure that most of you have either come to see me at this point or will over the course of your time here. I am the general provider of information for the OSA, and I'm always happy to answer any questions. I usually have an accurate response or fairly near to that, or can point you in the right direction. So I just want to thank Kenny and Curtis for inviting me to participate today. I'm very grateful to be here for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being that you don't often get the chance to talk in front of a group about something that inspires you, and particularly when that thing in question happens to be sitting here in this room. You are the group that sort of inspires me, and I want to offer a different perspective today. You obviously interact with your fellow students and faculty here during your time at the school, but you also have this sort of hidden relationship with the administrative staff. And so I figured, you might benefit from that perspective. In terms of my background, I don't have much of a background in nutrition. However, I've been working primarily in higher education for the last 4 or 5 years. And that ranges in experience from admissions to registration to student life, financial aid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And over the course of that time, I have gotten the chance to know several academic communities of students, faculty, staff, and each of those communities has their characteristics, their quirks, their unique traits. And I do have to say that by far, the one that has been the most impressive and the most inspirational to me has been Friedman. I have never before seen such a tightly knit, dedicated, driven, and supportive community of academics and professionals. And I really say that starts from the beginning, right? From beginning processing applications, helping out at admissions, and seeing how far you guys have come and how much you've already experienced before you even step foot in the school. And there have definitely been times when I'm reviewing prospective student resumes or personal statements, and my inevitable response, only half jokingly, is like, what am I actually doing with my life? I mean, I should join Peace Corps, I should, volunteer with, UNICEF, or, implement a, sustainable, garden program for an underserved urban community or something. And so when I'm really, thinking about the school and thinking about the student body, I really take a lot of inspiration from your experiences and sort of where you're all coming from. And that actually really benefits me as an administrator. It's very important to sort of be, obviously, as you know, passionate about what you're doing, and having such an inspiring group of students and faculty to be working for really, really is of fundamental importance to just general administrative support for the capacity of my role. I would also say that in terms of my own personal inspiration, I've always found that it's important to take advantage of the community that you're a part of and be educated through them, even if you're not really familiar with the topic. When you're working in higher education, you may or may not have a focus in that specific area or that school. And so the student population here and your individual passions and sort of collective dedication to inspiring and implementing positive change has really been inspiring to me, inspiring to try to learn a little bit more about what you guys are learning or what the faculty are researching, inspiration to take advantage of some of the educational opportunities that are available either through, symposiums or, talks like these, or even just student internship presentations. And so I would say that when you are sort of looking at us as administrators, really know that we really do take appreciation for all of the kindness and your own genuine gratitude and appreciation that I've always consistently experienced from the student population, from the faculty and staff. And so it just really helps inspire me as a professional, higher education professional. So just want to thank you all again for letting me participate this evening. And I look forward to hearing the stories and adventures that tomorrow always brings. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if you have burning desire to know anything about processing transcripts or anything along those lines. Yes?
No question, but just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Well, has being Friedman changed the way you go to the grocery store, talk to your friends? Do your friends ask you for nutrition advice because you know you get that?
They don't. The thing that I get the most when I'm talking with prospective students is, oh, and you're a student here too, right? Because you naturally absorb so much information about what this school is about, what's going on at the school. Maybe you develop an air of authority. But yes, personally, it has changed me. I mean, I love the nutrition magazines. I hoard all of them. I read them front to back. I'm not saying that I'm technologically efficient enough to be able to absorb all of that and apply it strategically, but absolutely. Even in terms of, whether I'm making the decision in the morning to have a yogurt as opposed to a bagel, and even if it's just a peer pressure thing, like I don't necessarily want to be seen checking out of the campus cafe with a Snickers bar. So it definitely has had an impact in a very positive way. Any other questions? All right, so I think we're going to keep moving along here. I'm going to turn it over to Curtis Moorish, who is a second-year BMN student. FN? Okay, close enough. There you go. Blame Penny.
Thanks, Molly. Okay. So, getting personal. Today, in medicine and in nutrition, it doesn't necessarily mean asking about someone's feelings or anything personal about them other than their genes. And that's pretty exciting, but I think there's all kinds of problems with that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those sides, the exciting and the problems. But before we do, we have to all go back in time, because it's important to think about where we all came from. So we're going to go back 200,000 years, back to when the human species as we currently know it was the human species. So you've probably seen this diagram or some variation of it before. Basically, it's the out of Africa human diaspora hypothesis, and I say that because it's amazing how little evidence it took to build this map, and also how probably likely it is to be accurate. For those who aren't familiar, we basically moved out of Africa into the Middle East and sort of split in two directions. One went to Europe and one went towards South Asia, which then split again, some going down to South Asia and Oceania, and others continuing over the Aleutian Peninsula or Strait and into North America and eventually down to South America. Now, why is this important to nutrition? Because to do this, we had to do some amazing stuff, most of which was adapting to all kinds of new environments that we'd never experienced before. And this is not one person walking from Kenya to New Zealand. This is like happening over thousands of generations of communities, of people who were hunters and gatherers, and then pastoralists, and then farmers, and are now consumers. And what happened was we created this amazingly diverse human genome, which we all have now inside of us in all of our cells, and it affects everything we do and the way we live and how long we live and how our life is experienced by us. So that's exciting, because now we actually know what our genomes look like. We sequence the human genome. You can actually do this on your own, or not on your own, but you can ask someone to do it for you for a reasonably accessible price. And they give you all kinds of information none of us understand. So we have people like Kenny who come in, they stare at, I don't know what they stare at, but they stare at stuff and they understand. They use their Superman whatever, and then so they figure it out. And that's exciting. It's like, wow, we can know everything about our health, about our food, about the way we want to live our lives. We can know everything we want to know. But we don't actually understand the human genome as well as some of us might think. And I think for me, being here, this is something that has been an unfortunate, sad truth, but has inspired me to be involved in research related to this kind of stuff, because I think that where I thought we were is very far ahead of where we actually are at. So you go to Google, and you type in precision nutrition. It's a big buzzword these days. People are into it. Obama's into it. So you got to be into it. And this is what you get. Prior to 2007, the word those two words together had never been searched on Google. Maybe that's part of the fact that Google hadn't fully taken over yet. But it sort of serves as a loose proxy, as a trend for this importance. And so what does that mean? It means that people are excited. All of a sudden, there is an answer to what you should eat. At least there's a potential. Someone somewhere knows and can sell you the answer to how you should live your life. This is amazing. You could live forever. Uh-oh, that was supposed to be delayed. Anyways, you can go online and find the actual Precision Nutrition trademark, which it's weird that that's a trademark already, but it's a company. For $50, they will sell you a package, and it ships within a day, and it's somehow personalized within that day to be your guide to everything you need, from weight loss to a six-pack, you name it, you got it for $50. Now, I don't know where the genes come into this because that's not clear, but somehow it's personalized and it's precise. So I haven't really said very much about what I was getting at from the beginning, is that there's exciting and there's also some things we have to worry about here. And so I'll start with what's exciting. There's a new organization called Food for Me, you might have heard of, and they are doing some really cool stuff, providing internet-based nutrition counseling that is as personalized as you can get it, and it takes into account your preferences, like what you like to eat, how you live, where you work, what you do in a day, and what you're already eating. And yes, of course, it also takes into account your genes. But, amazingly enough, these guys were pretty smart, and they decided to test whether or not having the genetic information in there actually makes a difference. And it didn't. They found that just listening to someone input, or having someone input their lifestyle and behavior and preferences through their iPhone or their computer, and then tailoring their nutrition plan based on that, was actually more effective and better adhered to than doing the same but adding genetically specific advice. That's kind of troubling because there's a lot of money going into genetically specific nutrition advice right now, and part of that is because the science might not be there yet to make it effective enough. Now, there's a newer version of this called NutriScope, which is so new they didn't even have a website. I had to make this graphic up just to illustrate what it does. But they take into account everything. Here's your environment again, your lifestyle, your medical history, your family's medical history, your own preferences and thoughts towards food, your DNA, what you're eating already. And they put all of that into a computer. And that spits out a day-by-day grocery list and day-by-day recipe list that is tailored to exactly whatever health goals you have. And if that's losing weight, lowering triglycerides, having more energy, sleeping better, you name it, that's what they're going to give you. So that's pretty exciting to me. I think it's pretty cool, and it's also something people can do without having to see a doctor, or they can do it, through their computer. But it's also something that maybe has some baggage that comes along with it. So, as I mentioned before, the science hasn't really kept up with the promises that it holds for us. So it's exciting to think that, NutriScope could tell you what to eat every single day for every meal, but that's only as strong from a genetic perspective as there is the library of gene-food interaction data necessary to give a confident counseling advice to someone. You can't really tell them anything unless you know for a fact that with that mutation in this food and this combination of other factors that they're going to see this outcome. And so that's a problem. And like I said, the industry is already way ahead of itself. It's already selling you precision nutrition and personalized nutrition, and we don't even have the science to fully back it yet. So that's one bone I have to pick with this. The second is, how realistic is it and how effective is this going to be? It's easy to think as a graduate student, perhaps if you're single, you're living alone, you come to school every day, everyone you know talks about food. All you do is go to school and then go to Whole Foods after, and then you could go home and eat your personalized meal. That's on your iPhone. It's ready to go. You get home. It's there. Tells you exactly, has instructions on how to cook everything. That's great. But what if you have a family and, no matter how identical you are to your siblings and your parents, everyone is somewhat genetically different to one another. In fact, to a larger degree than you might think. And so designing a precision nutrition meal for a family of 6 is a lot more complicated than it is for someone who has both the luxury of eating whatever they want exclusively in that moment, and also, how do you grocery shop for that? How do you plan for that in a whole week. So that's something that is probably further down the line. And I actually spoke to the guy who started Nutriscope, and he said that factoring a family into it is just astronomically complex. So almost on the point of like not being possible. So then you have to wonder, if that's not possible, then what's the point of this, right? There's going to be a pretty niche population. Which gets me to my next point, is who's going to benefit from this? And honestly, it's hard to think of how this could reach a lot of people. I mean, the idea is that with the advances in genome sequencing, it could be thinkable that this is something that happens at birth and you have it as part of your medical records. So anyone who's got a doctor who's been born in a hospital would have some access to their genes that can be given to a company that can tell you what to eat. Great. But when you look up the same Google stats on who is looking at precision nutrition, this is what you get. Who is it? It's North America, not even Mexico included in that, the UK and Australia. It's happening in other parts of the world, but this is really the population that's going to A, receive, and B, possibly have the luxury of benefiting from this kind of technology and this kind of consumer product, I would say within the decade, if at best. So with that, it's just, like I said, it's really exciting, but there's a lot of things that need to come with it, and I think that those may have been neglected so far. Anyways, questions? Yeah?
So I just want to know your opinion. What do you think about the role of industry in all this in terms of how we use this information? Is it something that should be sold, or is it something that should be, because it's got to be such a specific population, like sort of a tool for doctors, the public health community, to use for people who maybe have high triglyceride levels or something and need an adjustment? Or, I mean, is it the domain of industry at all, in your opinion, your public health community?
I would say certainly, and I mean that they're driving a lot of the research right now because they recognize like this personalization as something that's like not only sellable but in high demand. So they want it. They want to make products that are personalized. Now, how personalized is a mass-produced product? I don't know, right? So I think they have a role. I mean, they have like tons of money to do it too, so they could do it. But how they apply it, like, is it going to be a clinical thing? I don't know.
They're jumping ahead of really the research, and as you're saying, they're not really justified in giving these recommendations to people yet, given that the science hasn't backed it.
Right.
So without regulation, it seems a little dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. You're right. And especially without that hard science backing underneath all the genetic advising, it's like can run away pretty quickly. I don't know. Good question, though. Yes, Kenny?
Whose responsibility do you think it is, if anyone's, or if maybe it's a group or multiple groups that are responsible, but whose responsibility is it for tempering this enthusiasm or increasing the enthusiasm, for kind of modulating the enthusiasm for personalized nutrition as relates to where the science actually is?
Well, I guess it's kind of run away on its own. And no one can really bring it back. But I think what might be more important, not controlling how information is shared, but rather contributing to like a discussion about the fact that it's not quite there yet. Talking to people ask you, oh, like you do research in personalized nutrition, like, does that mean like they're going to come through on all these promises? Like, yeah, maybe one day, but it's not really close to that at all. And maybe that is where there could be more talk about that. It seems like it's all hype, right? Like a lot of hype, and there's no one saying like, oh wait, like this might not work out. Last question. Okay, go for it.
Do you think, so I know you're focusing on whether the genetic information is there, but just in terms of, you're saying, like behavior and lifestyle, that personalized nutrition could be beneficial now in that, like some people, oh, okay, if you have a night shift, like maybe you need to eat your meals at this time. Personalized nutrition from more of a behavior aspect could be at that point where it could be useful.
Yeah. And that's what the proof for me people found, basically, that like it's more useful than the gene. Then adding, and it was weird because they didn't just do gene specific, they added genes to that lifestyle specific counseling. And so with that, people were like, oh, this is weird. But they trusted. I guess their compliance was so much higher when it was just lifestyle that they I guess maybe believed in it more. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah.
So you're saying that the model is not really applicable to like families, but I know obviously like there are genetic diseases that run in families, and I know the preference is also sometimes tend to run in families just because of like the environment in which you were raised. So I'm wondering maybe if they took out some of the things that they factor in, if they could create like a family version of their model.
Right. So maybe make it a little bit simpler.
Yeah.
In order to, so it'd be a little bit less personalized, but familiarized.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great idea. Yeah. If you've seen the guy's face when I asked him, like, what about a family? He was like. But you're right. It could. Maybe the answer is making it simpler and not making it more complex. Doesn't need to be. Any more questions?
So science is lagging behind. What are some ways that science can speed up? Like, have you heard of like crowdsourcing? The idea of like crowdsourcing in science?
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I mean, part of it is that there's so much information already out there, and it's like making sense of what we already know. Like that's why data mining is so big right now. But yeah, I mean, maybe some more effort into like guiding specific efforts that are potentially more high yield in terms of furthering this kind of stuff might help do that, and you can do that, through crowdsourcing. But I don't know. There's so much excitement, and so people are like all doing their own thing, and we have little to show for it, I guess. Okay. So next up, Dr. Sean Cash is a professor here at Friedman, and he is going to be taking you on a journey. Here you go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Curtis, and thank you, Kenny, for organizing things tonight. So when Curtis mentioned the event to me this evening, he said, there's just one rule, don't speak about your own research. I'm like, I kind of heard that rule once before. And a few years ago at our professional society meetings, I had the opportunity to kind of give an analogous chat. A colleague of mine was putting together, he wanted people to just talk about provocative things, not research-based. So I'm an ag economist by training, and the circle I hang with, and Park's in the room, he hangs with some of the same people at these meetings. We think a lot about food. And even in the circle of food-focused agricultural economists, or especially, I would say, there's a lot of cynicism and skepticism about new foodism and food movements. And so what I decided to talk about when I went to this professional society meeting was I wanted to push them a little on that. I wanted to say, shame on you. You guys should be excited that finally people care about what we do. Because that's not really been the case for a long time. You could spend a career pricing corn, and that didn't necessarily excite the general public, but now it kind of does. So what I'm going to talk about the next few minutes, I want to take the flip side of that, the part that I was trying to defend there, and I want to push back to some of you on this, to Friedman students and the Friedman community, about some of the things that when we take our interests into the political realm and into the make the world a better place realm, could we do a better job? And I'm going to argue that economics is actually part of the key for doing the better job. So just a little bit of perspective or grounding on this. And you're all familiar with this. We all live and breathe it here at Friedman. There's so much excitement and agita and strong opinions about what we eat and where it comes from, and if we're eating the right thing. So this is a piece from a local media source a few years ago about, have you noticed the food fights heating it up? And it was all about how nasty food fights can be. And this is one of my favorite images for kind of showing how food activism confounds many things sometimes. When you see fat-free and low-fat, think chemical poop storm. This is being recorded, so I have to be careful with my S-bombs and other bombs. So the book is called Skinny Bitch, and the website promoting it is eatlocalgrown.org. So obviously there's more than one thing going on here, because there's concern about nutritional greenwashing, there's concern about non-natural additives in food, and there's promotion of local foods, and it's all as if somehow it's one thing. But eating locally grown isn't necessarily going to give you the other things you want here, or vice versa. And and visit the website to rate restaurants. So what often happens, and when we take these things that we care about, we know we can do a better job with producing food, with consuming food, with distributing food, with meeting the needs of people whose needs are not being well met, but then we try to take that into the realm of doing something about it, and often we reduce to fairly simple rules. Rules like eat local. Or rules like there's good things and bad things, and I'm going to eat more of the good things and try to stop eating the bad things. And if anyone wants to play with Captain Corndog and Baron von Broccoli, I have the action figures on my desk. And we come up with other simplifications in these debates, such as the political debate, where people typically on the left argue that the issues with food are that society's deck is stacked against us. It's stacked against being healthy. It's stacked against being good for the environment, and that there's a huge structural challenge, sometimes to the point of structural predeterminism, that really there's no room for doing better on your own because it's all stacked against you. And on the other side of the political spectrum, this strong belief that it's all about individual choice, so that the environment doesn't matter, and that it's just do the right thing or do the wrong thing and take responsibility, and completely ignoring the fact that given our time constraints and budget constraints, we do have to function within those environments. So I find this to be an oversimplification, which is certainly mimicked in other areas other than just food, but it's very heavy in food. So when we try to then take these things and implement ways of making the world better, what realm do we do it at? Do we do it at the behavioral level? Is it all about education? Is it about policies? And these are the things we talk about and learn about and study and research here at the Friedman School. And when you come and take your economics classes from Dr. Masters, from me, or others, you often hear about this economic perspective on policies. This is a slide that I might have shared with some of you before. This is my pantry of policies that may be relevant for the food realm. Research and development. These are all the areas where government either is involved or could be involved. Labeling and social marketing, marketing restrictions, school-based policies, process restrictions, bans, taxes and subsidies, nudging, behavioral economic tools, agricultural policy. And we learn in economics classes, and we talk about in economics classes, how to evaluate when we should use these policies, when we should pull these different policy levers. And economists such as myself tend to say, well, we should do it when the market's not doing a good job on its own, when we see a market failure. So the things you hear about in economics classes are things like when there's not enough competition, either for buyers or sellers, or we have information asymmetries, or there's externalities that third parties who aren't privy to a market transaction are either being harmed or benefited. Where we have poorly defined property rights, or where we have unstable markets, such as the impact of unpredictable weather on agricultural production. So these are the types of market failures we say justify government action. And then sometimes other arguments or levers for action are raised. Protection of children, regulation of broadcast media, expansion of the doctors. These are all things that might, be parts of the justification in the debate. So as an economist, often my contribution to this debate is to try to enlighten students with the importance and relevance of this model, this way of thinking. And I do believe it's very important. But I actually think there's a bigger contribution that economists can make. And we also need to think about what economists do when they're not in the classroom and when we're doing research. Okay, I snuck in talking a little bit about research, but not my own research. What does an economist do when she's confronted by local food and she has to get some research done? Well, she applies for a USDA grant to study consumer interest in it, Or she points out that minimizing food miles may increase total energy use or environmental impact. Boom, zowie, unintended perverse consequence, we gotcha. Or she eats it, because the people who study these issues and often make critical comments about the simplistic debates also enjoy eating food and are interested in food as much as any non-economist who focuses on food and nutrition. So, so this leads to some of these political aspects. And a colleague of mine who is very much on the right wing of many political debates wrote a book a few years ago called The Food Police, a well-fed manifesto about the politics of your plate. And it's an interesting book, but there was one thing in there that I thought was really interesting, and this was kind of his commentary from the right about what he sees as liberal food activism. And he claims that there's a schizophrenic paternalism that results from an awkward attempt to walk a fine line between a liberal agenda that yields to freedom of choice and expression when it comes to abortion, sex, speech, and drugs, but stops short when those same freedoms might benefit evil corporations like Big Food. It is an odd position that posits us so weak as to fall for anything offered by Ronald McDonald or Tony the Tiger, yet so strong as to know when to keep a baby alive or which truths to speak to power. So that's pretty harsh commentary of what someone sees as a liberal food agenda. And so as an economist, I want to fall back to things I can measure. I want to get beyond, or I want to see myself apolitically, ideally. I want to focus on things I can measure that hopefully most people can agree are important. And so if I think about something like local food, I wonder, what's the objective function? What is it that I am optimizing if we believe in optimizing behavior? What is it that we could do better at? And so is the object to minimize food miles? Well, as people have pointed out, that might not be really minimizing energy inputs or minimizing other harms. We wouldn't grow citrus crops in Massachusetts in hothouses to avoid importing them. So then, if we still believe that we should eat some of these citrus crops, what should we do? Is it calorie maximization? Is it all about we just want to have the most food available? I don't think that's the case, and many of us argue that calorie maximization is not just irrelevant, but the problem is harmful. Is it calorie minimization? That's not the case, and that's actually thinking that completely ignores the needs and challenges faced by the 10 to 15% of the U.S. population that USDA classifies as food insecure. It's not simply that we have too much food. Is it externality minimization, that I want to reduce all the harms? Well, that's maybe getting a little bit closer. Is it health maximization? Well, I would think it should be social welfare maximization, that if I can measure something, it's how well off we are. I'm better off if my food is cheap, but I'm also better off if my food is produced in a less environmentally harmful way, or if my food is healthier. And I want to be as well off as possible, not just on one dimension, but on all these dimensions. And I want to know how to measure that. And so what I think about here, and what I think the real contribution of economics, not finance, not the market, but the science of economics, is maybe hearkening back to about 45 years ago, to the start of the modern environmental movement. Because I want to argue that one of the big successes of economics as a science in the last 50 years is actually making all this a lot better. Because Earth Day started with a realization that we had gone too far in many areas, that we had polluted our rivers and our streams and been harming our wildlife and harming ourselves. And it set off a political movement that created the EPA, created things like the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, which is a law that requires review of big government projects. But it took a while to get beyond this idea that, well, we're going to make the environment better even though it's going to cost us a lot of money. And economics, I think, actually contributed to this, and engineering and other areas, by focusing on things we can measure and putting these things into common metrics that got beyond just reducing pollutants or making more money, but rather how do we balance out those things to maximize social welfare? We did not bankrupt the economy. The United States is far richer in terms of total output than it was before the first Earth Day. But we don't have rivers catching on fire anymore. We have much cleaner air in almost every part of the country. There's so many successes we could point to, even if there's still a long way to go. And so I think the contribution of economists in looking at things more holistically, costs and benefits, is what we need to replicate here. And what the real contribution of economics is to the current interest in food activism and food politics. And so I think the food fight would do better with a bit of a dose of economics. So foodies should go ahead and hug economists. And food activism redefined around measurable outcomes can increase social welfare. And what I think the challenge to all of us in the room is let's find those measurable outcomes. All the things we care about and we learn about, how would we bring that together into one set of things we can measure? So we can stop just saying, well, I bought 10% more organic food this year, so I'm doing better, but rather looking holistically at everything we care about in society and helping define what those things are, and then let the bean counters go and measure it. These trade-offs will always exist. The trade-offs that we see today might stop existing. We might realize, oh, these tensions aren't the ones we thought they were, but there will always be trade-offs. There's always trade-offs whenever there's constraints, and there are always constraints. But if you give us measurable outcomes, economists are quite good at proposing and evaluating tools for improving social efficiency of market systems. If we can define where we want to go, or how at least to measure if we're doing better or worse, then economists can actually do a good job of saying, oh, we just got a little further, or we got a little closer. And to my colleagues professionally, as I mentioned before, ag and food economists shouldn't complain that the public is more passionate than ever about the things that they study. They should seize the opportunity. And there's a saying among economists, which the Latin translates in English to that there's no arguing tastes. And that is that we take preferences for granted, and what you like, and then I should measure how well off or not well off, but what you like is what you like, and I can't really argue with that. And yet, economists trained in the same tradition will laugh at something like local food, saying, well, that doesn't really get you where you want to go. But sometimes the joy of local food might just be rooting for the home team apple. And so what I said to my econ colleagues is, any of you who would wear a sweatshirt from your local sports team, but laugh at the person who thinks it's really important to buy the locally made apple, is being quite a hypocrite. Because really, otherwise we should just root for the most efficient baseball team to win, right? So I'll end with that. And all the stuff we talk about in classes about incentives and social welfare maximization, all that, I think it still stands. I think it's still important. But what I want to know is, how can we really tell if we're doing better? And I think that the folks in this room are better positioned for that than just about anyone. Thank you. Diana?
So it seems like on the local, or on the kind of energy, hype, passion in the U.S. and kind of people these days about food is very different. It's a different type of thing from measurable things, important though they might be. So once we determine where we want to go, how do you channel passion or hype? How do you then direct that or change that? Or I guess maybe behavior change people would have a lot to say about.
Yeah.
Hype is very different behavior.
Well, and that's a part that I guess, part of what I see here is that there's a lot of passion. And so what happens to passion when a movement matures? So either that passion just goes away and you say, well, that was a trend, or that passion translates into pragmatism, which is what I very much see happen with early 1970s environmentalism. It became very pragmatic. And we have a complete regulatory structure that's very pragmatic and did not bankrupt the U.S. economy. And in fact, probably strengthened it in a lot of ways. And so I don't think that food activism is just a trendy blip on the radar, but I still think it's very much in the passion phase and not yet in that pragmatic phase. And what I want to do as a bean counter is go and measure stuff and count beans, and if they're organic, locally grown beans, that's great, but I want to know which beans to count. And I still don't think we've defined that and come up with this holistic system for saying, really, how are we better off?
So, how would you even begin starting to deduce what you want to look at?
So one of the things that I mentioned before, NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and what NEPA did was brilliant. So NEPA said, hey, any big government action has to be reviewed for environmental impacts. And it was passed by Congress at the time without, I think, even a realization of what they were doing. It felt like a feel-good law. But what it gave instantly was a cause of action, a legal cause of action, that led to kind of what we think of the Sierra Club and many other groups doing, which is find something that's not being done right or that's being ignored and sue the government to do it right. And so that it gave a stand, you didn't review the construction of this dam, you didn't review this, you didn't review that, and it gave legal standing. And it forced an environmental filter on everything government did. And I do think putting a health filter on much of what government does would actually be a way, it would force us to figure out, well, what does that mean? How do we measure the health impacts and nutritional impacts of what we're doing? People complain about the ag policies that lead us astray. They say, oh, this is not good for nutrition, that's not good for nutrition. Well, these policies were not put in place to harm our bodies. They were put in place usually to help farmers, and often to help our bodies by helping to ensure a more stable food supply. And then they had, over the longer term, unanticipated consequences. Some of those could be avoided, perhaps, if we said, no, you got to think of the health impacts before you do new things. And I think that'd be a way of forcing us to measure them.
So, just going off that, how does that work within the ag policy with regards to environmental policy when you've got shipments of goods across states rather than looking at sourcing it local to avoid that? You know what I mean?
I'm not completely sure I know what you mean.
Is there any, so you said that there's environmental lens looked at a lot of things in government, but have they applied that to their ag stuff?
It applies to, NEPA applies to things in the agricultural realm as much as anywhere else. It applies to any government actions of a certain size, which is kind of loosely defined in NEPA. Obviously, a nutritional filter or health filter would be more squarely focused on some of our ag policies, particularly if you've made it retroactive. Becca?
Over last year, there was that big op-ed that came out of the New York Times about a national food policy. Is that kind of the direction that you're pushing towards? Is that what you think is feasible, or is it?
It doesn't have to even be that strong as a national food policy as was envisioned in that commentary. But if we had basically a national policy that nutrition mattered and that it matters enough that you can't do big things that will harm nutrition, that's not as much as what I think they were promoting in that op-ed.
Going off of that, in this political climate, do you think that such things are feasible? Not just because we're so dysfunctional in general, but just because of the interests of food manufacturers and the different lobbyists who know that their food is unhealthy.
I'm actually not super pessimistic about that because we often talk about the food industry as being monolithic. But any change, small or large, creates winners and losers and creates opportunities. And you can look within the same company and see examples of companies that are playing both sides of a coin. One of my favorite examples is Yum Brands. So Yum Brands sells fast food. but they sell they have many different big fast food labels. And they can do different things at those. Now, none of this might be what we're going to say is the most nutritional food out there. But they kind of compete against themselves because they can. And a lot of these very large food companies can, a new law or a new interest is a new niche. And sometimes those same big companies that we fear the most in terms of the political power are the ones who are best positioned to innovate or exploit a niche. So they don't always stand to lose as much as you think they do in the face of change, particularly the ones that can be forward-thinking enough to anticipate those changes. And I think with so many things around regulation, we often assume or we see industries fighting it. But often what happens, particularly with the biggest industries in any area, this is true of environmental regulation, they fight it up to a point and then they promote it. It's like, hey, we're better positioned to meet these regulations than the little guy or the next guy or whatever else. We want to fight it for 6 months or a year, and then once we're ready for it, we're all for it. Because we're ready, maybe our competitors aren't. So I think those opportunities are understood by a lot of those companies, and I don't think they're as much in fight mode as we sometimes imagine them to be, even if we see them doing things in the short run that we wish they wouldn't, with lobbying efforts or other.
Like the question that came up in my mind was, okay, how do you have some kind of like comparable laws to the environmental laws that we have, because nutrition is so diverse and like there's so many different interests like packed into that idea that how could we ever even like agree as a movement on like what that means. But you could really say the same with the environmental movement. That's definitely been criticized for that, but it still has achieved these like landmark legislative changes. I'm wondering if you know more about environmental history than I do, and you can like identify how that movement came together, like different movements, I guess.
I think that's a real big question and topic, so I don't know that I have a concise answer for it. But I think it's going to keep being messy, and I think that's great. Yeah. I mean, to go back to my food fight slide, I guess I'm, if I want to be really geeky about it, I'm a bit Hegelian about the whole thing. That there's, thesis and antithesis come together and synthesize new ideas, right? And out of that messiness of the fight is how we'll get the best ideas. And in that view, the folks fighting against any change are just as important as the folks fighting for change, because it's that interplay that really teases out which ideas are the best. So I don't mind that it's messy. I think that's part of that pragmatism, is that out of the messy fight, the best things arise. And I think there's food in the other room.
Anyway, so thanks everyone for coming. I hope that was enjoyable and sort of got some of the gears turning. If you want to give a talk and you like this and like to give a talk in the future, we're going to try to have multiple more of these events, hopefully this semester and probably more in this semester and into the future. So let us know if you want to give a talk. There's our emails. Also, come talk to Curtis or myself. And other than that, thanks again to Sean and Molly for giving talks.